Prediabetes is your chance to prevent diabetes. It's hard to believe that prediabetes affects 96 million adults, which is 1 in 3. And unfortunately, more than 8 in 10 don't realize they have prediabetes. But luckily, a few years ago, the U.S. Diabetes Prevention Program discovered people who lost 5 to 7% of their body weight with at least 150 minutes of combined physical activity per week decreased their chances from going from prediabetes to diabetes by 58%. Now, we do have to mention some people were in the metformin group and did not do any lifestyle change, and their risk decreased by 31%, which is still pretty significant. And for those with diabetes, the numbers are now 1 in 5 don't know that they do have diabetes for every 1 in 10 that does. And type 2 diabetes is the most prevalent, 90 to 95% of all diabetes cases. And basically, type 2 diabetes means that your body cannot use insulin properly, so insulin cannot move glucose where it needs to go. So prediabetes can be discovered by a risk test. Now, it doesn't mean that you have prediabetes yet, but it means that you are at risk of developing prediabetes. So look at these 7 questions, add up your score. It's based on your age, if you're a man or a woman, if you had gestational diabetes, if you have your mother, father, brother, or sister that has diabetes, if you've ever been diagnosed with high blood pressure, how physically active you are, and your height and weight over in this category. So basically, if you score 5 or greater, that means that you are at increased risk of developing prediabetes without lifestyle changes. And prediabetes is actually diagnosed with lab work. So in the middle row, prediabetes, an A1C test of 5.7 to 6.4, a fasting blood glucose test, which means you ate nothing overnight and you came in and had your lab work done of 100 to 125, or a glucose tolerance test where you drink generally at 75 grams of glucose, which is quite a bit of sugary syrup, and at intervals after that, 1-2 hours, they measure your blood sugar, and if it's 140 to 199, it means that your body could not bring your blood glucose down to normal levels with that carbohydrate load. This is a very important graph because it shows that when you develop prediabetes, which would be the impaired glucose tolerance, your beta cell function starts to decline as your blood glucose starts to go up. And you can also see that insulin resistance increases at the same time. And look at the date. This is 1998. So this is not new information. Part of the problem with prediabetes is people don't often feel it, so they don't know that they have it. And by the time they do, their blood sugars have increased to the point that diabetes is diagnosed. And it's very important to understand storage sites and capacities. So basically, when you eat a carbohydrate, it is broken down to glucose and it's floating around in your bloodstream. And the whole point is that this carbohydrate, glucose, is supposed to move from your bloodstream to your liver and muscles for storage. But you have to keep in mind only a certain amount of carbohydrate can be stored. It depends on how much muscle mass you have and how much you use carbohydrate for training and activity. So if you're a more muscular person and you train more, you need more carbs to replenish your stores. So carbs are basically used by your muscles during more intense exercise, which really depends on the shape that you're in. And unfortunately, carb loading does not really benefit the average person or even most recreational athletes. It's really only intended for people who need to replace depleted muscular stores, those who train maybe 2 hours or more per day of pretty intense exercise. So issues begin when your body has no place to put the carbs because you're eating more than what you need. And they have to go into storage or they have to be put somewhere. So extra carbs could remain in the bloodstream if insulin resistance is an issue, which means your insulin can't get that glucose put into storage. Extra carbs can also be converted to fat for storage. And when fat storage limits are exceeded, the carbs converted to extra fat are forced into places where it doesn't belong. So that's when some of your organs become fatty, so to speak. And then these organs start to struggle with function, and then the trouble begins. And part of the problem is this is often very subtle until quite a bit of damage has been done. So what is this insulin resistance? The easiest way for me to explain it and what makes sense to me is that basically insulin is often referred to as a key that unlocks a door to let glucose go in. But I like to think of insulin as a delivery truck that basically transport glucose from the bloodstream to cells. And unfortunately, when you have insulin resistance, some of the cells say, hey, we're not going to take that delivery. And your blood sugar is higher than it should be, so signals are sent to the pancreas to keep releasing insulin. And the result is you have too much blood glucose and too much insulin. And over time, your pancreas cannot keep producing too much insulin. The function goes down. Keep in mind, carbs are meant to raise your blood glucose. That's what they are. But how many carb portions can you metabolize? And often, if fat is lowered in a food, then usually carbs are added because often protein's not. And we have 3 macronutrients: carbs, protein, fat. So are your meals mainly carbs, or do they include carbs, fat, and veggies? And if your plate is all carbs, then plate proportion may be a place for you to start to reorganize your plate, which basically means instead of a bowl of chicken and dumplings, you have 1/4 of a plate of chicken and dumplings, 1/4 of a plate of protein, and 1/2 a plate of non-starchy veggies. So what's important to know is, what is your glucose before a meal? Ideally we want everyone's blood glucose to be less than 100. However, some people with diabetes, 80 to 130 is a more realistic range. Then you need to know how many carb portions you eat. So keep in mind, every carb portion raises your blood glucose 30 to 50 milligrams per deciliter on average. And very important, does your blood glucose come down after a meal? Ideally, for those with diabetes, at least 140 to 180 2 hours after a meal. Or if your blood glucose is high and you're struggling and you're trying to get better control, is it at least coming down to the level it was before you ate? So insulin resistance becomes a problem as people age because you often become less active and you start gaining weight. Muscle supports your metabolism, especially carb metabolism. And while aerobic or cardiovascular is important, maintaining or building muscle is equally important. So you do have to move it or lose it. And then you also have to remember, insulin resistance does interfere with normal fat metabolism and storage. So I'm trying to put this in perspective with how much carb, and I realize this table is probably a little confusing, but to give you an idea, the U.S. Institute of Medicine recommends that sedentary people have about 130 grams of carbohydrate a day, which is less than 9 portions, which will make a little more sense in a few slides. Now let's say somebody is a moderate exerciser at 125 to 180 pounds. If you like numbers, usually you don't need more than 3 grams per kilogram. So that would equate to 11 to 16 servings a day of carbohydrate, which is not nearly as much as you think. Now, an athlete, that's a totally different story. Most athletes, their musculature is about 30 to 40% of their body weight. So they're going to be more towards 40. And a 2-hour hard session at a VO2 max of 65%, you will lose about 50% of your carbohydrate stores. So that's important for an athlete to replace. And 6 to 8 to 12 grams per kilogram is pretty normal, which basically is taking your pounds and dividing them by 2.2. So you can see that an athlete would need 23, 33 or more. But keep in mind, your muscles can only store 300 to 700 grams. So obviously the 700 gram is an athlete with substantial muscle mass. And your liver only can store 80 to 100 grams. So as we go through portions, hopefully this will make a little more sense, but keep in mind 9 to 11 to 16 portions will probably be the majority of what people need. I think we're all aware that we have become a very carb-heavy society. And why have carbs taken center stage? Well, many people find quantity more important than quality. And which macronutrients are the cheapest? Carbs. So when you look at something like chicken and dumplings or lo mein or fried rice. Heart health is often associated with eating less protein and added fat. So what's left? Carbs. And we're often marketed like the Wow potato chips, if anybody remembers those, because they used a different product in there that discouraged the body from absorbing the fat. Weight loss also often focuses on total caloric intake. Since fat has double the calories per gram when compared to carbs, people tend to choose carbs. But unfortunately, with supersizing and the way portion sizes have grown, we have just become accustomed to eating way beyond our appetite instead of paying attention to it. So food groups: grains, fruit, dairy, protein, oils, and then there are non-starchy and starchy veggies. So basically, carbohydrates include every food group except for what's primarily an oil or an added fat, and your protein. Grains, fruits, milk and yogurt, starchy veggies like potato, corn, and peas, and then sugars, which can be syrups, jams, jellies, barbecue sauce, soda, etc. So not only are many foods carbs, the portions are not nearly what we think they are. Because you have to remember, what you're served is often several portions. So cereals can range from a couple tablespoons, something like grape nuts, to a cup of an unsweetened puffy cereal. You really have to check the label for things like crackers. A third of a cup cooked of rice or pasta, half a cup cooked of beans that are plain, or mashed potatoes, and then a slice, so a half of a hamburger bun, hot dog bun, or a slice of what we consider regular bread. And then you have to remember that these vary in the amount of fiber, whether they're refined, partially, or 100% whole grain. And then there are also a lot of questions about processing. So have our manufacturing methods affected how our body recognizes the food ingredients, which has led to questions about food tolerances that we really still can't answer. And single portions of fruits. So a couple tablespoons dried, and that's assuming that no sugar was added, to 16 grapes, half a cup of juice equals 1 orange, half a cup of unsweetened applesauce is a small apple, and 3/4 of a cup of berry, or 3/4 of a cup of blueberries, and 1 cup of sliced most of your fresh fruits. Carbs in terms of dairy: 8 ounces of plain milk generally, which would equal we're assuming 4 ounces of chocolate milk because it was sweetened with syrup, but of course it depends how much syrup you use. 8 ounces-ish of plain yogurt versus 4 ounces if it's sweetened, but again, depends on how sweetened. 4 ounces of sugar-free pudding, but there's still milk in there, so it just means some artificial sweeteners were used. So 2 ounces of regular sweetened pudding would be considered a carbohydrate portion. And sugars. You don't get a whole lot. 1 teaspoon is basically 4 to 5 grams of added sugar. You know, it's not a crazy amount, but it does add up quickly because a tablespoon, a little more than a tablespoon of sugar, syrups, honey, etc. is considered a carb portion. 2 Oreos, 5 Kisses, a 1/4 cup of sherbet, and part of that is because it's all sugar. Sherbet has no fat, no protein, whereas ice cream, even though the calories would not be equal because you have carbs, protein, and fat, the amount of carbs are equal. So for foods like crackers that don't really fit into a standard portion size, a single portion is 15 grams of total carbohydrate on a food label, which again varies from something a little more than a tablespoon of sugar to a cup of fresh fruit. And sugars are now included as part of the total carbohydrate on the new food labels. So if there is sugar in there, you want to ask yourself, is it a good use? And then you also want to look, are you getting some fiber for the carbs? So for this particular product, there are 8 servings per container. 2/3 of a cup is a portion. And if you go down to the total carbohydrate, 37 Gs. So 15 and 15 is 30. So basically this is 2.5 carb portions, which includes 10 grams of added sugar in that 37 grams, which would be a couple of teaspoons of added sugar. And sugar is everywhere, even places you wouldn't expect it to be. So see if you can look at the ingredient list and identify where added sugar is in the food products that you're choosing. And the food label will tell you how many teaspoons, how many grams of added sugars there are. Remember, 4 to 5 grams is about a teaspoon. And many processed foods contain quite a bit of added sugar. Sugary drinks, we have so many sports and energy drinks, sodas. How many pumps do you put in your coffee of syrup? And a lot of juice and fruit drinks. A lot of cereals are sweetened, overly sweetened, hot and cold yogurts and smoothies. A lot of syrups and sweets and sugars, a lot of frozen treats, and then of course your baked goods. And again, size does matter. If you're having a 7.5 ounce, which I know seems like a baby can, but think how small the glass bottles used to be. The mini Coca-Cola has 25 grams of total carbohydrate. So for 7.5 ounces, that's almost 2 carb portions. And then what if you increase it to 20 ounces? So you would be taking that times 3, which is 75 grams of carbs, and that equals 5 carb portions of food. So what do you think would fill you up more? Here are 2 different breakfast bowls to consider. And your carbs can come from your grains, fruit, dairy, as far as milk and yogurt, added sugar, and starchy veggies. So on the left, your carbohydrates come from a cup of sweet potatoes, and that would equal 2 portions. There's also beets in here, which I did not count, some onion, herbs, and your 2 eggs are protein. Versus on the right, your grains would come from, you'd have 2 carb portions for a cup of cooked oats. A fruit portion would be every 2 tablespoons dried or a 1/2 cup canned or 3/4 of a cup of blueberries, but obviously there's not much fruit in this. You would have 1 carb portion for every cup of milk the oats were cooked in, and then every tablespoon of sugar added. So what has become very popular here lately is to have a savory oatmeal. So instead of making this sweet, you'd add tomato, maybe some avocado chunks, and an egg or two. So it's very easy for a bowl of oatmeal to have 5 carb portions versus on the left 2. So think about where those carb portions are coming from. So the goal is to decrease your carb load. So as you can see on the left, every Eggo size pancake is a carb portion, every tablespoon of syrup. So we're looking at least 5 and obviously more portions. Whereas the English muffin, each half is a carb portion, so that's 2. And then your protein is your cheese and your egg, and if it's bacon, that's a fat. In the middle, deep dish, that can add up very quickly depending on how many pieces you have because of the pizza crust. Whereas a tortilla, a 6-inch tortilla is 1 carb portion, and you just look at your label to see how many 15s are there. Otherwise, you have protein and veggies in there, and then your dressing, which is likely an added fat. Over on the right, M&Ms, dried fruit, can add up very quickly versus 1 apple, and there might be a little bit of added sugar in the peanut butter. So your to-do list. Look at how many carb portions are in your typical meal or snack. Consider using some non-starchy veggies to replace some of the carbs. Make sure your plate is actually carbs, protein, fat, and veggies, and not just a lot of carb with a little bit of protein. Plate your food and then maybe guess how many carb portions you have, and when you measure, see if you're surprised. And then really look at how many carb portions you typically eat in a day. So if you're interested in joining our weight loss group, our next series will begin on April 18th. We will have a 9 a.m. session and a 5:30 p.m. session. Just Google Memorial Hospital, Chester, Illinois, and click on the link, which will take you to our website. There are several different programs that flash across the screen, and this is what the icon for our weight loss program looks like. And if you want to know a little more specific information about the program, when you get to our webpage, if you look at the top bar and click on Services, and then under Services, Diabetic Resources, we have both of these PowerPoints attached, Program Introduction, and then basically the Confused Tired of Diets repeats quite a bit of what was covered in this PowerPoint, but it will give you an idea of what to expect out of the classes and see if this is good for you. So if you are interested in joining our next group, please call the hospital and extension 1170, which is my voicemail, and leave your name and your number. You can email msoellner@mhchester.com, or you can message our Facebook group and just look for the icon below.